My immediate family growing up, my mom and dad had 8 kids. I have 6 brothers and 1 sister. Growing up in Chicago, I couldn't have asked for a better family. We didn't have a whole lot of money or a whole lot of things, but we certainly did have a lot of fun.
What was growing up in Chicago like?
Growing up in Chicago, see, that's the only place I grew up, so I can't compare it to anything else, but it was fun because there was parks everywhere. We grew up about 3 blocks from Lake Michigan, 2 blocks from Wrigley Field. You know, so I spent a lot of, especially in my high school years, I spent a lot of time at Wrigley Field. We would go in there after a game and clean up the ballpark, and they'd give us a free pass for the next game, you know, which was kind of fun, you know, things like that. Started working when I was about 12 or 13, had a paper route. Then I moved from a paper route to the golf course and became a caddy. And when I turned 16, I went to work with my dad in his grocery store. High school, I went to Lakeview High School, which is right there on the north side of Chicago. It was fun. The best time of my life was in high school. I had so many friends and we just hung out together. Especially in the mid-60s. You guys are not familiar with the mid-60s, but the music and the fun, it was all there. You know, I can't imagine a better time to grow up.
When did you first hear about the Vietnam War?
Probably back when I was in high school, maybe 1960, 61. We heard about the conflicts of Vietnam, that the special forces, the Green Beret at that time they were called in and things like that. It never really got involved in a war until 1964 is when I became aware. At that time I was a senior in high school and I knew I was going to get drafted. So I started paying more attention to what was going on in Vietnam. When I graduated high school, I really didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. So I went to college. I went to 2 years of college because I knew that would be one way of staying out of the draft. But after my second year, I kind of ran out of money. My parents had 8 kids and, you know, and working, I couldn't afford to go to school anymore. So I thought, well, I'm not going to go back to school. So I did get a draft notice and I was drafted on October 10th of 1966. I had a really good friend in high school. We were really good buddies. You know, I mean, we did everything together. You know, and as a matter of fact, you know, I told you I was a big Cub fan. One of our fun things to do was when the Cubs would play in Milwaukee, we'd go up to Milwaukee and watch them, or Cincinnati or St. Louis. We'd take these weekend trips and go watch the Cubs and things like that. We just had a lot of fun together and things, you know. We had a name for ourselves, and we were called the Crypt Kickers. We always called ourselves Crypt Kicker 1, 2, 3, and so on. But we just had fun. You know, we would get to school in the morning about, you know, an hour early before classes. We'd sit in the cafeteria and have coffee and just solve all the world problems, as teenage kids do. You know, talk about the girls. Some of them would even come and sit at our tables, but not very long. One of our best trips was when we went to the Indianapolis 500 down in Indianapolis. We drove down there. We had no place to stay. So we just had our coats and things and we just found a park and went out there and laid in the grass, you know, and things like that. But that's the things we would do when we were there, that age. And he didn't want to go to college after, so he joined the Army right after. About a year later, he came home on leave. He says, "Well," he says, "I'm going to Vietnam next week." And I said, you know, we talked about it, and we went out and had a few beers, maybe more than a few beers, but we had a good time. He went to Vietnam for a year. You know, to tell you the truth, him and I, he said, "Well, I'm going to Vietnam," but neither one of us gave it too much thought. all right, hey, you'll be back in a year, so we'll catch up together, you know, and things like that. He wasn't, and I wasn't. We didn't write back and forth. So I don't know what went on. You know, I said, hey, you're going to Vietnam, and I got to go into service in October. I says, we'll catch up when we get back. And that's the way I think most people felt is, yeah, I'll go in there and I'll get this done and I'll be back. I should have known more because in '65, my older brother was drafted. He went to Okinawa, and his job was to take wounded military people from Vietnam and rush them into the hospital. The helicopters would drop, and his job was to get them into the hospital as quick as he could, you know, and things like that. So he saw a lot more than I saw. I have a younger brother who when he got drafted, he joined the Navy, and he did go to Vietnam. Okay, and he's got a lot of stories to tell. But back then, when we didn't pay attention to it. You know, we'd watch the news and things like that, but we didn't pay a whole lot of attention to it. Yeah, when Rick says, I'm going to Vietnam, okay, let's go out and have some fun.
When did you realize boot camp was different than civilian life?
Probably about 5 minutes after I got into Fort Campbell, Kentucky, when I was doing my dancing around and things like that, and when they told you to stand at attention, and then the sergeant came up and stood on my toes, and he says, Spencer, I don't care where you're from, drop down and give me 50 push-ups. You know, and I realized right then and there that this is a different world. I loved it. I was always pretty athletic and things like that, so the physical part of it came real easy, and most of the, you know, I really enjoyed boot camp, you know, because I got along well. I was able to do everything. There's a physical test that you have to do. You have to run so far, yeah, with a full backpack. Run so far in a certain amount of time. You had to do these rope climbing things, wall climbing things, and things like that. We had a couple of guys that were overweight. Okay, they could not handle this thing. And these drill sergeants would keep these guys out on the track field for hours and hours till they were crying. You know, I felt so bad for these guys. But you had to remember, these drill sergeants were trying to get these guys physically fit to pass the test. You know, and guys like me, it was no problem. But there was other guys that just did not have the physicality, and eventually they did it. Eventually they all got into shape enough to, you know, because these sergeants would, I mean, they were relentless, really relentless. I mean, they would swear at them and kick them and things like that. I mean, you would not wish this physical abuse on anybody. You know, they'd starve them, you know. But at the end of the 8 weeks, they passed the test, you know. And a couple of these guys, they would actually go up to the drill sergeant and give them hugs and say, I couldn't have done it without you. Yeah, boot camp was different. You know, boot camp, I hate to use the term, but it's more of a mind control thing, because everything you believed about being an individual, they had to turn around, because it's all about learning how to be a team player. It's all about you and your platoon being better than the guys in the other platoon that were in your company or in your thing. It was very competitive, and being a sports guy, I loved the competition. We had to do better, but we had to do it as a team. Okay, our team had to be better than their team, because one of the first things you learn in boot camp, okay, is that your life is dependent on the guy on your left knowing what he's doing and the guy on your right knowing what he's doing. They're dependent on you knowing what you're doing. So this is where the team and the camaraderie come in effect. You really became close allies with your bunkmates in the platoon. when you're in boot camp, you're training to become an infantryman. Okay, and that's what boot camp is for. Everybody's going to be an infantryman when they come out. Your first job is going to be infantry. You may have other jobs after basic training, but basic training is you're an infantryman. After basic training, they sent me to cook school. How they decided I wanted to be a cook, I have no idea. But I went to cook school at Fort Lee, Virginia. Okay, I graduated there, and then a sergeant came up to me one time. He says, you got some college? He says, how would you like to go to OCS? OCS is Officer Candidate School. And I says, I think I would like that. Because at the time, I really didn't know what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. And I thought, well, maybe being an officer was there. So I signed up for Officer Candidate School. I would have been a second lieutenant when I finished. Okay. OCS basic training was physical. OCS was doubly physical. I mean, there was a point where we would have a 5-mile run, okay, and if the drill sergeant didn't like the way you were doing it, we would always end up at this coal field, in Fort Eustis, and he would make us do laps around the coal field instead of resting. So it was a very physical and very demanding thing. The first couple of months. Then it started getting easier, and you started learning all the ways of the Army, all the nuances of the ranks and things like that. You learned how to do inspections. You learned how to talk to soldiers. Okay, what you wanted them to do and how you wanted to relate to them. You learn to talk to sergeants so that you can relay information down there. You learn the chain of command, and things like that. I have to tell you about one experience. So when I finished basic training and I got home, I wanted to look him up. And I couldn't find him anywhere. I finally got a hold of his brother. And he said, nobody told you? I said, no, what happened? He says, Rick committed suicide on his way home. I never got a chance to talk to him about what went on in Vietnam. I never got to see him, and I never got to, you don't know what went on in his life, what happened, why did he feel so that he took his life on the way back, after he was done with his service. There was something I never, talking to his brother and talking to his dad, they never knew either. That was the one thing, and I got that when I was on leave, on basic training. It's the one thing that, when I went back after my first leave, I thought to myself, boy, and it bothers me to this day, 50 years later, that I don't know what went on in him. I don't know if I could have helped him or not. I know we were good friends. I wish I could have had a chance to talk to him. But those are the things you learn when you're there. I seen a couple of guys that came back from Vietnam to Fort Eustis, and they were just not the same. That bothered me. I thought to myself, yeah, the biggest goal of my was, how can I avoid Vietnam? And I was fortunate to do it. But really, once you're in the service, you really don't have a choice where they send you or what they do with you. Like when I went to cook school, they says, hey, this is where you're going. I said, okay. Now the one choice I did have was OCS. Officer Candidate School. They cannot send you there unless you want to go there. So I did want to go there, but I also, when I got into that advanced OCS training, that's when I realized, I don't think I'd like to be in the Army the rest of my life. So I dropped out of OCS. But that's really, you don't have a choice. And Rick's. I think the one thing that I was able to do in the service once after Rick was I looked at people who came back from Vietnam differently. It was a total. I was more concerned, are they okay, or what went on? You know, there's a few of them. There's a few friends of mine that came back from Vietnam that I asked, what was it like over there? You know, and they would tell you stories, horror stories, especially in the jungles when they had no idea what was going on or what they were doing or things like that. But they survived. They came back. You know, so you got, and that's what I said. You're never going to be the same because you learn all these things. You know, and that's why I realized once I was in the service, I'm never gonna be able to go back home. I'm not a kid anymore. I was part of the quartermaster, and we made sure that everything was done on the fort the way it should be done. You know, the barracks were kept up to date. We make sure the maintenance, they did the regular maintenance and the schools and things like that. So there was, you know, our day was full of things like that. But my main purpose was any place that served food on the base was my responsibility. Wherever food was served, that's where I was, because I was a trained cook. Okay, so I had all that knowledge of what it was to be a mess hall and what they needed to do and things like that. So, you know, the Army is very particular about clean mess halls and things like that. You know, clean and make sure the food is properly prepared and things like that. They didn't want anybody getting sick while they're in the mess hall. The only place I traveled to was because the Army would send their inspectors to inspect any place where armies were fed. So I went to Norfolk, Virginia and inspected the mess halls, the galleys on their ships and things like that. So if they're going to be troop carriers, then we'd have to make sure that we blessed them and said, yeah, you're fine, you can carry our troops. Okay, I was bunking with a little, he's about 5'3", 5'4", Russian guy. He was, and his accent would always tear me up. I love it. I loved his accent. He was in the service, and he and I were going to cook school together, and we were in there one night, and we were in our room, and there was a bang on the door. Okay, and it was about, I don't know, 2 o'clock in the morning, and opened the door, and it was this girl. Okay, she was not supposed to be there. Okay, so she says, I'm hiding from the MPs. So I let her into the room without realizing what I was doing, and she went and sat on the bed. Okay, and he was sound asleep. He was snoring like crazy, and she was rubbing his head, you know. And I realized what I was doing. I grabbed her hand, and I said, you got to go somewhere else, you know. Sorry about that, you know. And so I went back to sleep. Oh, a few minutes later, the MPs came knocking on the door. We're looking for somebody that's not supposed to be here. I said, you are. And this time the Russian guy woke up. He came to the door where I was, and I said, there's nobody here. And the MPs searched the room, and then they left, and then he closed the door. He says, is that true that there was a girl in here? He says, I was not dreaming. In his Russian accent, I said, no, you were not dreaming. But that's you know, those things, those are experiences that we go through.
But when you mentioned you would talk to families when they came back.
Oh, and yeah, the deceased families, yeah.
Yes. Was there any training for that, or was it just
no?
So they just.
That was just part of my job. Now, in the first, number one, by the time they came, there were military people who were stationed at our Fort Eustis. Okay, their families were still there. Okay, but the deceased they already knew about the deceased. The funerals were planned, the funerals were done, and things like that. Our job was just to follow up, to make sure that they knew all the benefits that they're entitled to, and make sure that they got the counseling if they needed counseling and things like that. Make sure that everything was in place for them, you know, so that they didn't have to worry about a thing, You know, we would take care of it all. And they knew their contacts and things like that. We make sure that everything, you know. Now I only had to do that about a half a dozen times. That was tough. I mean, I'm a very emotional person in the first place. There was a couple of things, especially when I would see kids. I mean, after, you know, I would hold it together while I was talking to them. But I'll tell you what, there was a few times that I went back to my barracks and cried and say, why? You know, but, you know, you held it together because that's your job. You know, when you're talking to them and things like that. Like I said, most of the emotion from them they have dealt with it because, you know, they had already done the funerals and things like that. It was just a matter of, you know, especially if you had to give them personal belongings. Twice I had to go and get personal belongings and bring it to them. You know, that's really tough. Probably about 99% of the people I met in the Army, they all wanted to do a good job, get their service done, and go back to their normal life. The one thing that I learned in basic training in the Army is, you know, I kept telling myself, well, I'm going to go into the Army, and get my 2 years out of the way, then I'm going to go back home into a normal life. Well, there is no more of a normal life. You have to establish a new normal. Because I tell you, the things that you learn, the people you run into, it changes your outlook and your meaning and things like that forever. You're forever a changed person. You know, there is no going back to a normal life, you know, like I had when I was in high school and college. But it was for the better. You know, I often say that I grew up in the Army. I became an adult. I became mature. I realized not everything was music and dancing and beer drinking and things like that. Born and raised in Chicago, all of a sudden I'm bunking with guys that are born on a farm or raised on a farm or born, and anyone came from all different walks of life, and things like that. You had to learn to get along with those people, and you had to learn to work with those people. And I can truly say that most of them became my friends. No, you heard about it because you'd watch the news, but it really didn't affect you when you were in. It was only affected when when I was on leave. I got jeered a couple times when I came to O'Hare Field. I didn't pay much attention to it because, that's the way things were. The one thing that affected me the most, my first job, and I was in the break room, and I was talking to a young lady, and she must have been a couple of years younger than me, maybe about 20 years old or something. And another guy and I were talking, and he was just out of the service. And she looked at me and she says, "Oh, you guys were those baby killers, weren't you?" That hurt. That really hurt. And I often think to myself, I wonder, because this is 50 years ago, what happened when she was getting married and she had some kids and she had maybe children in the service. I wonder if her attitude would change. Because I tell you what, that really hurt. But I know that when I got out of service, and most everybody that I've ever talked to when I got out of service, they didn't bring up what went on. They didn't want to talk about their service. They didn't want to be a part of it. I mean, we would say, "Yeah, were you in the Army?" "Oh yeah, I was in the Army." Things like that, and then let it pass. They didn't really want to talk about it. Got home, and it was pretty scary because I had just gotten married. My wife just told me she was pregnant, so I had no place to live and no job, and I knew I wanted to go back to school. and that was, you know, and the other thing was, when you got out of the service back in 1968, you weren't always welcomed at home. There was a lot of anti-war things, so you had to be very careful. But we lived in my wife's parents' basement for a couple of months until we got our own apartment, and then I got a job. And then after my first daughter was born, then it was, you know, it's time for me to think about going to school, and I registered for. I went to Roosevelt University, and Roosevelt University was tremendous. They for returning vets, they had a program where they accepted all your previous college credits, and my first 2 years in college weren't exactly. I wasn't. You know, I was getting good grades, but they weren't really good grades. You know, but they accepted all my credits. Okay, and they had started at what was called a computer technology degree. You know, and I can get that computer technology degree in about 18 months. Okay, which I did. You know, and for Roosevelt University, and went on, and from there I got a job at a computer company, and I spent the next 35 years there.
You said that you were married while you were still in the service.
Mm-hmm.
So did you meet your wife while you were? How did you meet your wife?
Oh boy, I love that story. A month before I was already drafted. A month before I was due to go in, an ex-girlfriend of mine was getting married. So she says, "Come to my wedding." She says, you were kind of neat to hang around with, even though I'm not going to marry you. You were kind of neat to hang around with. Come to my wedding. I said, "Okay, I will." And you know, she put me in a spot with her cousin, okay, who was there, and her mom and dad, and it was her cousin that I met, and then I really liked her. So the next week I called her up and I says, "Let's go out." So we went. I think we went bowling or went to a movie or something like that, and she was just so neat. And then we went out almost every day for about a month until I got drafted. So the day I got drafted, I had to be there at 6:30 in the morning. Okay, so we went through our physical and all the rigmarole and get sworn in, and yes, pledge allegiance to the United States, and did all that. And then I had about 5 hours before the train would leave. Okay, but I could not leave the building. Okay, so I called a bunch of people and said, "Hey, I'm stuck down here. Come on down and say hi." And nobody would call. Finally called her, and she said, "Yeah, I'll come right down." So she came down, and we hung out together for about 3 or 4 hours. Then when I was drafted, we started writing letters back and forth. Okay, and then right after basic training, and I came home for leave, and we went out, and my dad had sold my car and got rid of all my personal belongings. I had nothing left when I got back home. So she had a car, and she says, "I'll tell you what," she says, "you take my car and you do all the things you have to do during the thing, and just come pick me up from work. Drive me to work and pick me up from work, and the car's yours for the whole week." And boy, that was really neat. You know, we wrote back and forth. After that first leave, she would write all these letters, and these letters would be kind of nonsensical. It'd be, "Oh, you know, I had fun doing this," or "I had fun doing that," and things like that. And she would write on the bottom of the letter, Holland, Holland. So it took me a while, and I finally got up the nerve. I says, "What does Holland mean?" And she says, it stands for "Hope Our Love Lasts and Never Dies." That brings a tear to my eye. Hope our love lasts and never dies. She had a lot of trouble at home with her mom, and she would write to me because my house was like a zoo. You know, I mean, there was 8 kids and friends and things like that, and coming and going. She said, "You know, I love hanging out by your house." You know, and I had a little brother who was 7 or 8 years old at the time, and she loved to play with him. His name is Howard. And they got along. And then one time she wrote me a letter and she says, hey, she says, your brother asked me out on a date. I says, my brother did. She says, yeah, what am I going to do? I says, go out and have fun. So she says, about a week later, I got a letter back and she says, you know, she says, going out with Ted was a lot of fun. But she says, I think I'm going to stick with you because so far you're the only sane one in your family. I said, good, I'll go along with that. But we got married the following June. She had a lot of troubles at home, and we were going to wait till after I got out of the service. But she was having a lot of trouble with her mom. Her mom was such a picky person, you know, that there was nothing that could satisfy her and that type of thing. And so she says, you know, there's an open date in June that we can get married. I said, fine, I'll be back home. So I made a leave. I really didn't think anything of it, you know, except I'm going home to get married. You know, wow. You know, but I got married in June. We went back down to Fort Eustis because I was still going to be serving till October. You know, and one of the neat things about this thing is when you're below a certain grade level, they take half your salary, they double it, and they send it to your wife because they don't trust you to take it home. So the first month we were there, and she gets this check in her mail. She says, they sent me this check. I said, yeah, I know, that's your subsistence for service. She says, you mean I'm getting paid just to be married to you? I said, yeah. She says, we should have done this a long time ago. But that was, you know, unfortunately she passed away much too soon. She was only 35 when she passed away. You know, but like I said, she gave me 3 wonderful daughters, and they give me 5 grandkids, and you know, and she's never far behind because every time I see my daughters, there's a little bit of her in every one of my daughters. So I know she's there.
Do you want to go into what you guys do?
We're involved in what's called a stand down, okay? And if you came to my garage, you'd see half my garage is loaded with clothes and boxes and stuff that the community contributes. Clothes that is still good, but they don't use anymore, and things like that. We're going to be at the UAW Hall in downtown Rockford next Friday, and we're going to host 160, up to 200 vets. We're going to give them clothes. We're going to give them resource information if they have drug abuse or alcohol abuse, if they're homeless or whatever. We got all sorts of resource information. They give them haircuts and dental work, and we're going to feed them 2 meals Friday, and we're going to host about 200, and they're going to help themselves to all these clothes. We got Army blankets and Army fatigues and things like that, and it's just a lot of fun. And there'll be about 200 of them. Okay. The other thing that I'm very proud of with Vietnam is we do what's called Christmas for Vets, where we go to all the retirement homes and living facilities, and we host the vets for a couple hours, and we bring them blankets and socks, and we give them cookies and things like that. And last year we did 48 facilities around Rockford, and over 1,200 vets we got to meet with, and just celebrate and say Merry Christmas and things like that. I feel very fortunate that I didn't have to go to Vietnam. I didn't have to experience what they experienced. But at the same time, I always look and wonder why was I spared when 58,000 others were not? Why did my number not come up to go to Vietnam? I always felt a little guilty about that, you know, and I feel very lucky and very fortunate, but I always felt a little guilty about that. So, sorry about that. I get a little emotional when I think about those things, I mean, you know, when I look back at Vietnam and I say there's 58,000 service people who didn't get the chance to enjoy this beautiful life that I've had. They didn't get a chance to be doctors or teachers or garbage pickup men or whatever. They just didn't get that chance, that I got. I don't know why it was me. I was married before I got out of the service. When I discharged, my wife was pregnant with her first child, and she blessed me with 3 daughters, and they gave me 5 grandkids. And although she's not around to see the fruits of that, she's been my guiding angel for the last 35 years.
It is a fun class, and even with all the stress, when you get it all done, you hand that doc to that vet that you picked to listen to their story several times and get it to edit it to where you put the story up onto YouTube or other video media players. It gets that relief. It's strong. I mean, I've not had so much stress, but so far, actually working on my doc, there might have been a little bit, but it wasn't like where I was like, oh my God, I'm not gonna be able to make it through. I'm gonna have to give my vet an unfinished doc or not be able to give him a doc during the gala, which is our big event where we give our veterans the document we made from their story. And it's just you feel bad as a person if you don't get to. And then when you do get to, and it's just the joy you feel of giving them what you made from their story. It's just amazing. It's like nothing can be better than that feeling. It's pretty much a run it all the way or go bust. But definitely, if you're in high school and you go to Harlem, and you're able to take this class still, well, I definitely suggest taking it. At least try to do 1 year. Maybe you try to get 3 in my opinion, because it's something you don't get to do every day, unless you plan on doing video editing, in documentaries and that. But it's fun, that's for sure. It's definitely fun.